Doctors of Reddit, what was your how the FCK did you survive that moment? Second year during my neurosurgery residency, woman got shot execution style, kneeled down on both knees, shot in the back of the head, think Boondock Saints style, by her husband, who then shot himself. In the other patient was barely breathing and had a hemoglobin of 5.0. There was so much scatter from the metal artifact on the CT of her head that we didn't know what we were getting into, but we brought her emergently to the OR to do an exploratory craniectomy. We made incision and took off a flap of this thick, mangled skull where she was shot in the back of her head. Her shards of skull tore a massive hole in her superior sagittal sinus, big brain vein, that we had to repair. We found some small fragments of bullet but no big slug. When I went back to repair the portion of skull we cut out to access her brain, I found the bullet embedded in her skull. As we get older, our skull thickens, but this girl was young. She had an abnormally thick portion of her skull in the area where she was shot. After the case was over, I looked back at her CT and it was a miraculous abnormality. The patient ended up surviving with no neurological deficits. She is a completely normal and high-functioning individual in society at this time. This strange thickened portion of her skull saved her life. If she would have been shot anywhere else in her head at point blank, she would have undoubtedly lost her life. I'm not one for fate or higher power, but this story always gives me goosebumps. Humans are like an iPhone. Sometimes they can survive a 10-foot drop, and sometimes they break when they get tossed on the bed. Not a doctor, but I'm a firefighter, so I see my fair share of trauma. About a year ago, we responded to a call that went out as an individual who had a car fall on his face. He was hotboxing in his garage while working underneath his car that was supported by scissor jacks. Something to note, the car didn't have any tires on the front end where he was working. One of the scissor jacks had slipped out from underneath the car, and the whole weight of the car landed directly onto the side of his head with no tires to stop the fall. We got our rubber airbags out, lifted the car, pulled him out, and got him onto a stretcher. After taking 2,500 pounds of weight to the head, he somehow got out of it with a fractured orbital and a laceration on his cheek. I hate scissor jack, never trusted them. This is also why jack stands exist. First year of my core surgical training, I was on call in a very small rural hospital. This hospital only had 2 doctors on at night, me and a medical trainee, and no emergency doctors. It's about 11 PM and this guy, 26, comes in after being in a fight, blood pumping from his nose which was clearly fractured. I suspected he probably had other facial fractures underneath, but he was awake and talking to me, otherwise seemed fine. I spent about 45 minutes trying to stop the blood, using all sorts of nose packs, pressure, even tried a catheter balloon to try and tamponade it. Nothing was working, and he was starting to go into shock, and I was basically crapping myself at this stage. Based on his vitals, I'd estimated he'd lost almost 1.5 liters of blood so far. Nearest proper surgical hospital was 45 minutes away, and my consultant was at home, 25 minutes from the hospital. Eventually I got 4 bags of oneg from the lab. The lab tech happened to be in, which was very lucky. Put this guy in the back of an ambulance, still bleeding, and sent him blue light to the surgical center in the city. Got a phone call about 3 hours later from a surgeon at the other hospital, saying he had brought the patient to theater and been able to control the situation. He was probably 15 minutes from dead. If you come into that kind of small hospital with that much bleeding, all stats say you're in trouble. The guy was very lucky his friends got him in so quickly. That's the worst thing about working in a rural hospital. Not only are you understaffed, but people in rural communities always have the most inventive, gnarliest injuries. Well done for saving his life. I was a surgical resident in a small town hospital. We got paged to see a patient for a speared piece of driftwood through the leg. We were thinking it was a nicked femoral artery and discussing if this poor kid needed amputation. When we saw him, he was standing on the skewered leg taking a pee. Turns out the wood missed every single one of the vital vessels and no fracture, just muscular damage. Junior doc on the trauma team. Doors to reses fly open to reveal a man carrying a second blood-soaked man in his arms. Get him onto a stretcher and it is clear he has gunshot wound to his chest and has gone into cardiac arrest. Asystole. Chest compressions start and within minutes the A&E consultant is performing an open thoracotomy in order to start cardiac massage. Cardiothoracics join us quickly and get to work on the heart. A hole in the right ventricle is identified and plugged with a Foley catheter. All the while bag after bag of oneg is being pushed into the patient in an attempt to replace everything that had pumped out of his heart and into his thoracic cavity. 15-20 mins into this the impossible happens. We get ROSE. The heart starts beating on its own. Patient is taken directly to theater where the hole is definitively repaired and bilateral chest drains are inserted to drain the blood filling his lungs. Technically the pleural space. Somehow his heart continued beating and after a couple weeks on it too, the patient is returned to the trauma ward awake and alert. Several weeks, some mild hypoxic brain injury, and a gnarly chest scar later and he walks off the ward with his dad, the man who carried him in. ETA definition of ROSC. That's like something out of a TV series. I had a patient that attempted suicide with an AR-15 under the chin. Put a hole in the soft tissues of the floor of his mouth, in his tongue, in his hard palate, and then split the hemispheres of his brain perfectly, finally popping out the top of his skull. He recovered fully. Emergency nurse. Once had a guy come in who had been cutting a tree with a chainsaw when it hit a knot in the wood and kicked up into his neck. Finished cutting the tree because he knew his wife would make him get rid of the chainsaw. Put a towel on it and drove himself to the hospital. CT showed no vascular damage. Simple washout and home the next day. One of the paramedics who saw him said to his patient, "That's a real emergency. Why don't we ever get those?" Finished cutting the tree because he knew his wife would make him get rid of the chainsaw. Reminds me of a story I heard from a teacher. He knew a farmer who got his hand caught in some machinery and mangled it up pretty good. Put a glove on over his hand to keep it one piece while he finished his work, then went to the hospital. Every time I think this question, the answer is usually M. One guy got hit in the face hard enough to let air into his brain cavity and was being an absoluter, which seemed to be normal for him, and literally asked, "Got any M?" when I offered some pain relief. To my understanding, he recovered without any need for surgery. The human body is both scarily resilient and scarily fragile. I was working in the emergency department when a toddler came in after falling out of a 3-story window completely unharmed. The sad thing was they were from a rough neighborhood and the mum hadn't noticed for about half an hour. Apparently the friendly apartment pot smokers found him, checked him over and sat with him for half an hour, and when mum didn't show up went to find her. The child was admitted overnight mostly for social reasons, but it's just amazing how well kids bounce. Not a doctor but paramedic. Once went a car wreck where a drunk drove headfirst into the corner of a brick bridge at 100 miles per hour. Took a huge wedge out of the bottom of the bridge and left the car about 1/4 of its normal length. All the impact was on the driver's side. Turned up only 2 minutes after the crash and fully expected it to be a fatality. Walked round to the driver's side and somehow he was fully conscious but squeezed into the only space left in the car. Took almost 3 hours to get him out, and on extracting him out he had absolutely nothing wrong with him other than being a pee up Eris hole. Still think, how the frick did he survive that? Not a doctor, but a friend's story. He'd been feeling like crap for a long time. Went to the doctor. Doctor ordered a bunch of blood tests and ordered them on a rush basis. The lab calls the doctor to bee him out. "Why the frick did you make us rush these tests?" Doctor is confused. Lab is like, "The guy is clearly dead, so what's the fricking rush?" Doctor calls him, tells him to not drive but to get himself to emergency ASAP. Guy was a type 1 diabetic, hadn't realized it until way later in life, and apparently his blood work suggested he was a corpse rather than a living person. He's still doing fine. I work in the lab and we have had several not compatible with life results where the patient's body had so slowly become accustomed to the bad levels that they were actually doing only poorly instead of dead. The human body is a magical thing. Not a doctor yet, but during one of my night shift as a medical student, I had to take in charge a patient who came to the ER for a car accident. Well, that's quite common. What is not is that he came by himself. from 40 kms by calling a taxi because his car was absolutely wrecked in the accident. Normally, when your car ends up upside down, after 2 or 3 rollovers at 60 km per hour, which the patient did, you are not really fine. However, he was totally okay. No broken bone, no head trauma, no abdominal pain, nothing. He just came to the ER because he had little dermabrasions over his knees and one elbow, and it hurts when it rubs against my clothes. 3 band-aids later, and he was good to go. Gotta be the seatbelt that saved him. Eater, airbags probably too. Not a doctor, but a fellow worker took a 35-pound steel plate being propelled by 3,770 C, equivalent to 188.5 car tires, to the face, sent him 15 feet in the air, and 40 feet back, broke every bone in his face, lived and back to work 8 months later. Patient, not as cool as most of these, but I was puking for 3 days straight before going into urgent care. I wasn't even going to go in, but my family said I looked awful and I eventually relented. They said I had appendicitis. Due to a mix-up I didn't get operated on for over a day later. When they went in, my appendix was gangrenous and had basically disintegrated. Turns out it had burst ruptured days ago. Normally, this floods your body with toxins and you die, but apparently my colon was positioned in such a way that it blocked that from happening. I was in the hospital for another week before my digestive system restarted and had to have bile pumped out of my stomach. All in all though, not a terrible experience. This sounds too similar to a Yelp review. Would almost die again. 7/10. Intern year doing surgery. Guy gets brought in for a gunshot wound to the head. He was working at a jeweler that got robbed. His co-worker was black bagged at the scene. He gets brought into the trauma bay and it's pretty hectic because GSW to the head and well he's alive. Not only is he alive, he's following commands but not speaking, probably from the shock. Cops are giving us reports saying he was likely shot with a .357 snub nose they recovered at the scene. So we do our primary and secondary survey and all this guy has is a single wood wound to his left frontal scalp where the bullet went in. So the team hasn't really seen something like this before. Sure, a GSW to the head wasn't new, but this guy was otherwise completely fine. The decision was made to get a quick frontal and late head x-ray to verify where the bullet was before proceeding to CT. Well, we don't see any bullet on the films. There's no bullet on the board or bed or within the patient's clothes. The man was shot in the head and the bullet bounced off his skull. CT showed no fracture even. It was wild. Never seen anything like that since. Our never broke bone approves. I'm a researcher rather than a doctor, but during my undergrad my anatomy tutor told us of an interesting case study. A woman in the same department had been in a car accident going a considerable speed. The seatbelt failed to lock and her face flew into the steering wheel. Her mouth, nose, cheekbones and forehead were shattered, yet she suffered no brain damage. Apparently, the front of her face acted as a crumple zone and the fact her skull shattered meant the cranial swelling didn't cause any damage because the brain had more space to swell into. She needed significant reconstructive surgery, but a year later she and my tutor teamed up in a research project. They used her case as the basis for looking into new ways to treat severe head injuries and developed new treatment protocols depending on where the skull had taken damage. They basically found out that, if you're going to have a head injury, try and get hit in the face and not the temples because you're much more likely to survive. My sister had a similar accident. She was drunk and fell from a 3rd-story balcony. She caught her foot on the way down, almost tearing it off, and face planted the ground. Her face absorbed the impact. Her ankle is fused, and her face is back to normal, except for a slightly fatter nose. Psych patients definitely win this one. This schizophrenic woman thought she was an angel and had wings, went off of her meds and tried jumping out of the 4th floor balcony. Half her bones were shattered. Her skull and jaw were fractured, which had to be wired, but she miraculously survived. All her words come out weird and there are scars all over her body, but she's alive. Shen still thinks she's an angel. Farmer was driving a tractor with one of those huge rolls of hay on the back. The hay was not secured correctly, so when he stopped it rolled forward over him and bent him in half. All he had was 2 compression fractures in his lumbar region. Not a doctor, but a patient. My husband took me to the local hospital's ED for ongoing severe lower abdominal pain. I figured uterus. The nurses took blood, hooked me up to an IV, and gave me a little pain medicine. A nurse I hadn't yet seen came into the ED room looking very nervous and told me I was being admitted as my platelet count was 6,000. My husband and I were like, what? The nurse was very surprised I had no symptoms like bruising, nosebleeds, and blood in urine or stool. He looked very concerned and the medical team rushed to get me into a room. The only symptoms I had were fatigue and heavy menstrual flow. Both symptoms had been my companions since I started my period at 11 years old. The next morning a hematologist came to my room and explained my diagnosis and that it was entirely idiopathic. He told me I was lucky to not have had crazy internal bleeding into my brain or a stroke. He prescribed a regimen of 60 mg of prednisone daily, which I was on for a year and a half. Not recommended. It was awful. The idiopathic thrombocytopenia made no progress. It was finally decided to proceed with a splenectomy. Recovery was brutal. Having a huge incision down the length of your abdomen makes everyday tasks very difficult and painful. Almost 5 years later, my platelet count is normal. My period can go to heck in a handbasket, though. Not a doctor, but I've seen a guy walk into a holding a band-aid over his eye saying he needs someone to pull the bullet out. My mind was freaking blown. To get shot and walk it off. An elderly lady had a massive brain hemorrhage, was transferred to terminal care to the health center inpatient ward I was working at as the doctor. Her prognosis was that she would die at any moment. There was no treatment. She was comatose, but breathing spontaneously through a tracheotomy tube. A week passed, with no medications, no food, no fluids, still alive. Then she began to stir, came conscious, delirious, but conscious. So we started IV, fluids, appropriate medications, and eventually physiotherapy. After a few months she moved into the local nursing home, lived for a few years. She had profound dementia, but was able to move. I wonder if the air moisturizing device in the room, because of the tracheotomy, kept her hydrated, because a healthy person would generally not survive a week without fluids. Not a doctor. My dad, who is one, told me this story once. He has this 12-year-old patient, let's call him Tim, and everyone in the hospital firmly believes he's immortal. Tim was born with a bad heart and is constantly in and out of the ICU. By in and out of the ICU, he goes in almost once or twice a month. 9 out of 10 admissions, Tim flatlines. Strangely, Tim always comes back, even if you don't resuscitate him. I'd say Tim flatlined about 15ish times in total. It's at the point that whenever Tim flatlines, nobody panics. Not even his mom, and the first 3 times she fell on the floor crying. Hey guys, Tim's vitals are dropping. Again? Whew. The kid's definitely going for a record. Tim's pretty chill about it too. He talks about his IQ trips like how a normal kid talks about a mildly eventful day at school. Nobody knows how TF does Tim always come back. He just does. Frankly, I'm surprised the media hasn't done a story about it. BC, it's freaking metal. Okay, now I want biannual updates on Tim. Tim reached the big 3-0 today. Tim's had a good year and the IQ has been awfully quiet without his resilient spirit. Not yet a doctor, but I work as a paramedic in soccer events. Being from Argentina, it can be pretty freaking intense. There was this time when we were at the stadium with my colleagues and 3 guys carry a 4th guy, covered in blood and totally unconscious. His pulse rate was berserk and we got kinda worried. While we start strapping him to the stretcher, I asked the other dudes WTF had happened, and they told me he fainted and fell down the stairs, and as he didn't respond we gave him some C to wake him up. We rushed him to the ambulance and within the first 10 minutes, the guy walks out and asks for a sandwich. Humans work in mysterious ways. A patient in his late 90s was admitted to our hospice for terminal care, i.e. to die, because of untreatable multi-level bowel obstruction, confirmed on CT scan, and clinically obvious from his swollen abdomen and profuse vomiting. The guy was, however, absolutely charming and completely at peace with this. He did want discomfort, and felt he had had a good life. He was scared to eat because of the vomiting it caused. If your bowel is blocked, then any eating has to go back out the way it came in. Otherwise he was comfy enough with just a little pain relief. He was also lovely to chat to, very reflective and articulate in his speech and mannerisms. He had been told he had days, possibly hours, to live by the surgeons at the local hospital, and he barely drank anything, and ate literally nothing. This continued for 2 months, and though he lost a tremendous amount of weight and physical capability, it seemed that during this time his bowel obstruction had spontaneously unobstructed. We ended up getting him home. The sad thing is, however, he had completely come to terms with his death. He is now still petrified of eating, and believes super strongly that his bowel is going to obstruct again, which it may. He just doesn't ever want to go through that experience again, and I do sometimes wonder if he would have been better off dying peacefully with us. Carotid blowout following free flap reconstruction in an oral cancer case. Had a post-blowout HB of 30. No idea how she got away with it. Also, when working at a military hospital, the guy whose parachute didn't open, and he ended up with just a fractured cheekbone? Like, what? I am not a doctor, but when I around 23 I was stubborn and didn't go to the doctors for feeling weak and numb all the time with some blackouts. I brushed it off until I literally couldn't get up to walk to the bathroom, thinking it was just a cold or flu. When I finally made it to the ER, my blood count was a 3. Regular is around 14. Doctor said he didn't know how I was alive still. Imagine a doctor walking in all confused and being like, "Son, ya don't got no blood." Early years in medical school, I saw a surgery of a policeman who was shot in head in a gunfight. The bullet went through his skull and brain. With my experience in games and movies, I always assumed a headshot is instant death, but that man survived it and I was in shock how this can happen. Turns out in many cases a headshot can be survived. Sorry for my English is not good. Your English is pretty good. I understood you easily. Close bracket. Emergency physician. I had a patient that was shot 9 times, 3 bullets to the head. He didn't call an ambulance. He brought himself to the emergency department. And by that I mean he drove himself to the emergency department. The 3 bullets in his head somehow didn't enter the cranium, so his brain was just fine. One of them entered his cheek and went underneath the skin to swing all the way around to the back of his head. He was discharged the same day. Not a doctor, so sorry, but I'll contribute. I will never ever forget a guy coming into the emergency ward with a freaking serrated combat knife sticking directly out of the top of his head. He was walking himself in. To this day I cannot comprehend that. I read this one where this chick tripped over while cooking or something, then started experiencing a bad headache. She drove to the emergency room and found out that she had a knife sticking out of her head. You have been visited by the romantic doggo. Comment love is magic so you never fall in the friend zone. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video, or don't. Either way, have a great day you magnificent people.